Now I would like to go over more evidence of buildings melting. Sorry about that. I used the wrong one. I want to use it a little thinner. So you can see how it became smooth and began to melt here. And just some more pictures. As you can see, the melting here, it's become smooth from the melting here. And from above, you can see what looks like melted ice cream. But it's all the result of a major grid failure, meltdown, melting all the buildings on the grid and everything around it like ice cream. Again, this is actual building. How the red brick lines have been just smeared and other parts cooked. It's melted like ice cream here. Notice how it melted away and swollen up. You can see the brick lines here, the top of the tower and dome there. Here, you have brick lines. It was super hot, melting. You can see the crust on the outside. It actually even preserved the carbon dense orange red brick color of the brick. It almost looks like lava still. It's incredible that it almost looks like liquid lava still, the melted building. Here's the brick lines here. Almost looking pretty gritty right there. Grid, I mean. Melted like ice cream, domes, arches, windows, everywhere. Completely melted. Grid meltdown. As you can see, it's like melted ice cream. The entire grid melted down. Everywhere you see above the flooded waters is nothing but melted buildings. The only reason all continents are melted buildings. Yes, that's right. No such thing as continents or mountains. And again, what you can see here, just absolute building structure completely melted. Towers, domes, everything just melted like ice cream. Here you can see the brick lines. And again, everywhere you look, you're looking at melted buildings or the tops of melted buildings sticking up out of what was hot liquid melted building flood. Again, you can see the structure here before it was melted. The brick lines melted like ice cream. On the left, it was separating, forming holes when it became melted and viscous. As you can see here, the red brick concrete was melting. It was really hot. It was melting down, you know, and then all of a sudden it froze it and hardened it in time. Hard as a rock because it is concrete and red brick. And what you'll notice here is we'll get to this later. I'm not going to go into that right now. You'll still see the irrigation system still intact, water flowing out of all these melted buildings still. Again, look at all the melting here. And on the right, the building on the right was completely obliterated and melted. That's all. That's a building. And then this building here melting over and then frozen in time. And the irrigation system's still intact. Here you can see the building, how it melted out towards the water here. Again, all this is flooded. Here you can see the A-frames from the melting. It melted out this way. then it got flooded. The actual ground level and buildings are flooded. The actual ground level's down there. Every continent, everything is melted buildings. Here you can see melted buildings, and then the liquid buildings flooded all around the grid. It was hot, melted these buildings like ice cream. And then they hardened real fast as well. As you can see here, it was melting, forming these rock curtains, just melting this concrete red brick, just forming these rock curtains, and then it froze them in time, in midair. And of course, the irrigation system's still intact. The water is still flowing out of all these buildings. I'll get to a video on that showing the countless evidence of this. More melted buildings. You can see the melting. Here you can see the melting. The concrete molds just completely obliterated and melted like butter. More melting. Concrete molds melted. Here's more building grid on the ground melted building. Here's more melted buildings. Just completely, once it becomes so hot, once it becomes so hot and viscous, it begins to flow, you know, in these wave after wave, because it's becoming from a solid into a liquid. It's melting the brick lines like ice cream. The X Factor event melted these buildings. And look at the steps, how they've been completely melted. Here you can notice the smooth texture here from being melted. Here you can see it, the waves of it being melted. Here you can see the concrete molds of this statue's head has been melted, and it's dripping down smooth this way. Smooth. Took his head. Again, underneath all the concrete molds, what do you see? Red brick, of course. Red brick. Again, this is fantastic. Go get you some butter or ice cream and just throw it in the microwave now. And this is what you get. It starts to melt. It starts to flow down. It's become viscous. Hot. Here it's flowing down from the top, you know. It's hot. Here you have what was probably some type of statue or monument, concrete molds of a building here that have been, how do you call it, scorched, melted. See the waves. And again, when the heat expands, notice how it is expanding in all directions perfectly in an even circle. It spreads out this concrete. See how it spreads out the concrete to the point that some of these rocks become so buoyant they float. It spreads out the concrete so much as it expands out the heat in all directions. Not these specifically, but there are rocks that float because it's just this red brick concrete that has spread the concrete so thin that instead of it's dense, it becomes buoyant over the water and it floats. More rock curtains dripping down, melted buildings, pancaked brick lines. Here you can see how the building melted down this way. They put a lot of golf courses on melted buildings. Again, you can see the structure here. This was all hot like liquid, melted building like lava. And this is the top of what didn't get flooded. That's why it looks awkward and buried and flooded, because it is. The rest of this has been damaged, as you can see. And there's remnant right there, pocket of survival, pocket of survival. I think this is the Ritz-Carlton Hotel or something. Again, more melted, more holes, more separation. Here is really crazy and unique because you have rope, wooden barrels, wooden barrels, rope. And then you have liquid concrete that was hot. You still can see the actual color of the lava. It actually froze in time for us to see the color of the lava as the heat expanded and broke open this crust of concrete before it was hardened, and before the X factor event hardened, all this concrete was flowing over wood, rope, getting saturated to an extent over this barrel. You can see where it opened up here. This was hot like liquid lava. See the color is still there as well. And the concrete has come all up on and into this. And these are all hard as a rock like concrete because it was all melted liquid building. It's flowed on top of it and densified it all and hardened it like concrete. But you can see here where it got hot and ripped open the thin layer, and it's still the same color as hot lava. Again, there it is. Excuse me. Still the same color of hot lava, red brick, carbon-14, color cooked out here. It's busted open, the thin layer, when it was hot. You can see how how this is dripping. See how it's coming over? Rock curtaining, dripping, and covering everything, and hardening it up like hard as a rock in liquid building concrete, because that's what it was. You can explain everything when you have the truth. It's all concrete. Look, it's just concrete. It's all melted concrete. You can still see the color of the brick here and the lava. All melted concrete. See, the wood has been turned into concrete because it saturated it with the liquid building when it had melted. And then it hardened up again, and because that's what it is, it's concrete. It saturated in the wood and it formed concrete. It's not a fossil. It's actual liquid melted building getting saturated with other objects and then hardening. It's as simple as that. Just like this. You can see where the building has become hot and melted and then began to flow and flood itself. And I love this here. I love how you can absolutely see how this got hot and began to flow in this direction, covering up the grass. And then it stopped and hardened and like a rock, and look, that's all hard as a rock again, but it was flowing. You can see the direction of it flowing like hot lava. Imagine that being hot like lava and flowing in that direction. It's just hot liquid building from the grid meltdown, from the X Factor event, and which was probably a grid meltdown. And you can see how it was flowing this way. It's probably a grid meltdown, which could be effective. The dual sun arcing against the dome and the grid. Here you can still see. Here you have the towers, the brick lines, the melted towers, buildings. Melted buildings flowing, getting melted like ice cream. Showed this earlier. Here's a close-up of the Ritz. Here on the left you see the columns, the towers. But it's pretty much very melted building. Here you can see it was flowing, viscous, wavy after wave. Here you can see the concrete flowing that way. Pocket of survival, that this whole thing has been melted and flowing this way. When it becomes viscous, it begins to flow out and form new land. Tower, brick lines, towers, arches, windows, all melted buildings. Again, you can see the direction of the flow when it begins to melt out and away from itself. You see the melting. See how that melted out this way, cooked out the color. That was really hot there, cooked out that red color carbon. Here you can see the flow. Whoops. My mouse is tripping. Here you can see the hot melted buildings was flowing this way. Here's a person down here, two of them. Just enormous, huge buildings being destroyed and melted. Here they are being melted outward. Here's all the different melting away like butter and ice cream. Melting, connecting, melting. Getting flooded. Brick lines, arches, windows. Hot scorch marks, dripping. It's quite an X-Factor event here. Here you can see that this has basically been melted like a pile of ice cream here. Wave after wave, viscous. People here. Again, all these buildings, everything you're walking on is melted buildings. Here you can almost see how it was flowing and viscous before it hardened back up. This building has been completely melted. Here you can see how it's melted down in a way, and you can still see the brick lines. Here you can see the melting tops of these buildings sticking up out of the flooding melted building. Here you can see what's left of tops of buildings. Looks like it got hit by a pretty hot, fast wind. Here, it's fantastic evidence of the building is just melting and dripping downwards, forming rock curtains, literally. And then it hardened back up in thin air, in midair. And again, the irrigation system is still intact and flowing out of these buildings. I'm going to show an entire, shortly, I'm going to show many of these waterfalls, which are really just irrigation systems still intact, still flowing out of these buildings. And again, the rock curtains, melted buildings, and then frozen in midair, hardened. And again, this statue, concrete mold is melting. Excuse me, and then it's hardened back up in midair. Again, this building is melting outward, forming new land. As you can see, it's melting outwards, flowing outward, melting. What's left of buildings. Here, this is all melted like ice cream, just like melted butter. Here, more rock curtains melting down. Irrigation system still intact. Again, more literally like curtains of rock. Just like literal curtains of rock here, frozen in time, hardened and stopped in midair. It's hot, it's melting, it's falling, and then no. Freezes it, hardens it in midair. Tons of this evidence all over the world of buildings melting and then frozen in midair, densified in midair, frozen in time for us to see these rock curtains forming from melted buildings. Incredible evidence of red brick, literally, and concrete melted together. Again, you can see how it was melted and out this way, and then this melted. And then this, you get the brick lines of the building, and then it just melts outward, forming new land. Whoops. Again, remnants. Pocket of survival, hardly. You can still see that this is a building, and then it's just completely melted like butter. Just look at how it's melted everywhere, dripping wet. Some drip with the black scorch marks from the heat. Here it's melted hot. Again, very melted. Again, more evidence that the buildings became hot and viscous. Anybody could have came along and did this when the buildings were hot before they died. If they died. Again, this is more evidence of how this became very hot to the point it was viscous and malleable and impressionable by a being. A hand here, pressed against this here and here. And then it hardened back up again, hard as a rock, because that's what it is. Here you see the little holes pulling apart from being viscous when it was hot. Again, this became hot and viscous and melted. Look at this. It melted. It literally melted the tower here. Here, it melted the concrete molds. Here, it turned the bottom of the red brick building into rock. Here, it was melting and flowing down into the street on the left here. It has literally flowed down into the street here. More melted building, and here's a little tiny pocket of survival of what it looked like before the rest of it was melted. The top here, a little pocket of survival, but this was columns and concrete over red brick. Here, mangled, destroyed. You can see the melting layer after layer, layer after layer, as it melted its way down. It solidified, densified, layer after layer, wave after wave of melting down on itself, and then it hardened in layers after layer of the melting, and it hardened back again. There's an A-frame there. I showed this one, but these are brick lines completely melted. Tops of buildings. Here, more brick lines. Tops of buildings up here. No such thing as mountains, canyons, valleys, gulches. It's all just buildings, in between buildings. As you can see, the buildings melted from the bottom as well, from the grid. Here, the upside down ice cream cone roofs have been melted down to hardly anything left of the buildings. There's hardly anything of the roof. The upside down, tower to the dome style roof. There's some brick lines here. Here you can really see the melting and the flow, how it's just flowing down and melting, forming rock curtains, concrete, because that's what it is. You see the A-frames from the heat melting down over the arches and columns of the concrete all over itself, so you can't tell that it was a building. So the layman can't tell that this was a building, but to those who do the research, the eagle eye crew, they get the eyes to see, and they can clearly see the melting and the dripping, and that all mountains were really just melted buildings. And it's hot, viscous holes. Then it becomes malleable, conforming to some type of grid or heat field. See these grid lines. Another phenomenon we identified from my research. Again, what you see here is buildings melting away from the center of itself, flowing outward like ice cream. Everywhere you look, melted buildings like ice cream. There's a person here. It literally kind of looks like melted ice cream everywhere, like sherbet. Here, the inside of what it looks like in the inside of these buildings when they melt. There's no such thing as caves or underground bases. It's all just inherited, confiscated, melted buildings. Again, a lot of these buildings get completely filled in, but sometimes they don't. But it's melting, it's hot, and it's hardened again in midair. Remember how I showed the rock curtains, how they hardened in midair again? That's what happened here as well. It was all dripping, wet, hot, and then it hardened and caught it in midair so we could see it, if you will. Again, just look at the concrete molds here that survived in here, but it's all melted buildings. You can see more melting here, more melting, viscous, separating, pulling apart, creating these holes. and then hardened again. Here it was melting and then hardened again. Again, here is what they call lava from a volcano, but it's really just some of these buildings still hot from the X Factor event. And this is what happens when it gets hot. This nature of heat is when the solids get really hot, they become viscous and flow. And when they cool off from the cooler temperature blowing on it up here, it hardens again. Hard as a rock. You see the cooler areas here where it hardened very fast again. And then where it's hot and it's flowing and becomes viscous again. This is the nature of heat. And you'll see this in all of the melted buildings from the grid meltdown. This is a close-up of brick melting, red brick melting. And here's red brick and concrete over the brick melting, kind of melting together, if you will. Here, the inside of buildings dripping and then solidified and hardened again. Here, the ground was so hot and viscous and melting that the entire building sank into the ground. Here, the building sank into the ground and pancaked the brick lines, and it became, you can see where it was hot and flowing, and then hardened real fast again. Incredible melting here of the interior of these buildings. Here's the exterior rock curtain here, melting this building. Here, ceiling from the old world, infrastructure melted black from the X Factor event. Here the ceiling mortar is melting. More melted buildings. See the waves after wave of melting here when it became hot and viscous. Whoops. And then you see the arches from the buildings, the domes. Here it's just completely melted. Here it's melting down and then hardened real fast again. Heat from the bottom, from the grid, melting this building. Wavy, melting brick lines pancaked. Brick lines melted, sinking into the ground. Structure from the old world melted. The red brick down at the bottom here, this whole thing was brick, red brick, but as you can see, it has balloon rocked out and expanded outward. But it was all originally red brick. But it expanded outward when it became viscous and balloon rocked outward and formed these rocks from the X Factor event. Again, more structures from the old world melted. Hot brick-lined buildings just melted like ice cream. Tops of buildings everywhere we look, sticking out of the flooded ground. Melted, flowing, hot buildings. Flowing outward and away from themselves. And then the interior. Please excuse my cough. I'm sorry about that. And then look at the interior melting here. Dripping. Frozen in time. Tops of buildings melted, sticking out of the ground. Here, separating viscous hot. Coming apart, melting. Like ice cream. Flooding away from, look at that, melting, flooding away from the building here. The interiors of these buildings completely melted. Except for some open areas here that we call caves. This incredible evidence of melting from the X Factor event. Here you can still see some color from the brick, the red carbon-14. Heat expanding outward in circles here. Heat expanding outward in circles here. Melting over. Tops of buildings sticking out of the ground. Melted buildings, rock curtains concealing the building behind it. Pockets of survival. Here you have the building just completely melting in this area here. And here pretty good too. Brick lines, melted red brick.